Good morning, Bloom.
Good morning.
Oh, it's wonderful to be here with you, and an honor and a pleasure to bring this sermon commentary, or as some people have said, the weekly rant. In another church, I had a couple of men sit in the back say, "Well, there he goes again," and his friend would say, "Well, you can't stop him." So here I go again, and hope you enjoy this time together we have. The letter comes to us in a letter to the Ephesians, and last week we had part of this letter also read, and there was a discussion between John Poole and Ron Lang as to whether or not Paul wrote this letter. And I'll leave that discussion to Ron and John as to whether or not Paul wrote it, because there's evidence in here that Paul wrote it, and then there are scholars that say Paul didn't write it, and then there's scholars that say that Paul did write it. Now, I don't want to get into that argument, but I'm on the side today that Paul did write it, because there's evidence in here of Paul's thinking and Paul's theology. Now, what does that mean? Did that mean Paul wrote it, or a student of Paul wrote it, or a person of Paul's school wrote it, or Paul's study wrote it, or Paul's history? It doesn't matter. Paul's influence is here. Paul's thinking is here. Okay, are we okay with that?
Yes.
Whether or not Paul wrote it or not, it doesn't matter. Yeah, okay, we got it. Okay, because I don't want to have John and Ron get into any more arguments. Okay. Thank you very much. The reason I want to lift up Paul is that I know that Rev Kev and a number of people have a problem with Paul. They think that Paul is so prejudiced, homophobic, against women's rights, against everybody's rights, and just he doesn't like anybody. And everybody hates Paul because Paul is not progressive enough for everybody in this contemporary society. And so everybody wants to write off Paul. Okay, I'll give you that. But you can't write off Paul completely, because if you write off Paul, none of you would be Christian. None of you would be in the church. None of you would be here. If you write off Paul, Christianity would be a small sect of Judaism in the Middle East someplace, and probably forgotten now in the generations. If it hadn't been for Paul, Christianity would not be a universal religion. So you got to give Paul some credit, okay? Some. And actually, if you think about it, a lot of credit. A lot of credit for lifting Christianity out of being a small, provincial, Jewish sect into a universal faith. And that, ladies and gentlemen, for Paul's time and place, was progressive, was very inclusive, was very non-discriminatory for Paul's context and place where he lived. Now let's just look at that for a minute. If you ask Paul to be inclusive of all races, Paul probably wouldn't have a problem with that, because his society didn't have a problem with races, it had a problem with nationalities and familial separations. If you ask Paul to be inclusive of women, he would short circuit up here, because it simply wasn't imaginable on his part. Women were what? Property. They just simply weren't part of the picture of equal rights. It wasn't in his imagination that you considered equal rights for women. It would be like asking Paul What do you prefer, a Chevy or a Ford, Paul? He would short circuit. It's not in his imagination that there were cars in the world. He couldn't conceive of it. If you asked Paul, should we be inclusive of gay and lesbian people? Short circuit. Not in his imagination. The word homosexuality wasn't invented until the mid-19th century. He didn't even know the word. The word sexuality wasn't invented until about the third into the 19th century. Sexuality. Sexuality wasn't even considered an issue during Paul. If you asked him about homosexuality, what? He wouldn't know what you're talking about. It's not fair to say that he wasn't inclusive about those things when it was not in his context to understand them. If you asked him, Paul, what's on the other side of the ocean? What? Not in his context of thinking. Paul, what's on the other side of the moon? Not in his thinking. Why would you ask him to consider things that aren't in his thinking? Actually, it's the same thing about Jesus. He's silent on these things because it's not in his context of reference. What was in Paul's context of reference? Think about him for a minute. Remember Paul for a minute. Remember that Paul was a latecomer to Christianity. He wasn't one of the first disciples. He wasn't a disciple. He was a latecomer apostle. He appointed himself to be an apostle. All right? Why did he appoint himself to be an apostle? Because he had this wonderful story of being converted to be a Christian. Remember, he used to what with Christianity? He used to persecute them. He used his intelligence and his wit and his ability and his articulation to persecute Christians. He'd round them up and send them into prisons and to death and to crucifixions and to all sorts of other things that the Romans did. That Paul did that. And he used his intelligence to do that. Somewhere along the line, he was converted away from that into being an advocate for Christianity. That's an incredible conversion. That's a 180-degree change. Do we give him any credit for that? Do we go, attaboy, Paul? Ever? Do we? He became the greatest church builder of the first century. Do we give him any credit for that? But let's look at what he did for Christianity after his conversion. He looked at Christianity, and it's a lot to do with this scripture reading that we read this morning. And said if Christianity is going to be anything like a New Testament or a new religion or something different than we've got already, then it has to be universal. It has to reach out beyond its provincial groundings into the rest of the world. We have to include the Gentiles. Now, when Paul did that, that was radically, and I mean radically, progressive. That was enormously, grossly progressive. inclusive. That was beyond the imagination of everybody else's context. To say that you would include Gentiles into this religion that everybody else thought was just going to be another faction of Judaism. That's incredible. And that you have to look at Paul and say, wow, that's big. Nobody did that before. Nobody could do that before. And listen to what he says. This is grounded in love, but brings you to the depth and length and height and depth of the power of God. It brings you to your experience in life, and yet it surpasses the knowledge of God. It brings you to the fullness of God and God's abundant ability. He's talking about the fullness of human experience. This is talking about the human experience of this faith. It's not talking about the law, tradition, or ritual, or practices, or a book, or anything else that defined religion. It's talking about your human experience of your relationship to God, and that has nothing to do with whether or not you were Jewish or Gentile. And I think now if you asked Paul, if Paul was sitting here, and you made the cross from Jewish to Gentile, we would say, does it include women and gays and lesbians and anything else you can name in that whole spectrum? And you go, well, duh. If he can put Gentiles in that group, duh. I think you can give Paul a break. Because in the words of our friend Donald Trump, this is huge. I don't know that that gives it any credibility, but it's a fun word to say these days. This is one of the biggest things. And one of the things that I like that John Poole often says is he says, this is what makes me want to be Christian. This is what makes me want to be Christian. That if God isn't a universal God, then God really isn't God. If Christianity isn't a universal faith, then I don't want to be part of a little provincial group of people. If Christianity isn't pervasive love that's inclusive for all people, and I mean all with a capital A, then I don't know if that's the kind of love that I want to be a part of, because I think love is for everybody. Everybody, I mean everybody, with a capital E. So what Paul did is enormously important for our faith. And it makes us be the kind of church that this church is. It makes us the kind of people that we claim to be. It makes us say, wherever you are on the journey of faith, you're welcome here. If it weren't for Paul, we couldn't say that. We'd have to say, well, if you're on the journey of faith to our family, you can come to our family. This is so important that I think you can see it illustrated in our society recently. And I love to have it shown in the headlines. When the Supreme Court made its decision on equal marriage, you saw all the headlines that said, "Love wins." I just got a kick out of that because our right-wing friends like to say that this country is based on the Judeo-Christian principles, right? And so that this is a Christian nation. And they want to say, this is a Christian nation and all yada, yada, yada. They want to say all that kind of stuff, right? Well, love wins. I think they're right. Because if Christianity is universal, then love is universal. And if it influenced the Supreme Court to make marriage equality universal, then love wins. And so I think this whole thing that's influencing our country is part of the foundation of our country. And yeah, maybe, not that I agree with the right wing, but the joke's on them. Love wins. And if you look at the latest deal we made with Iran, where you can see that maybe some hardline people decided that nuclear weapons and the threatening of nuclear weapons is not the way to go, but maybe peace is a better way to go, then maybe love wins again. And if love is winning in the world, if peace is winning in the world, then that's the kind of love and peace that Paul is talking about here. When we are grounded in love, yet we can reach to the breadth and length and height and depth that surpasses all knowledge and knows the fullness of God and God's abundant power. We can go from here to there, and to there, and to here, and to there. We can do all of that far beyond we could ever imagine because of this love that we know in Jesus Christ. And because of that, love wins.